Good evening, everyone. My name is Ms. Babati. I am the research analyst here at CIRS, and I would like to welcome you all to tonight's talk titled Strategic Timings in the Appearance of News, Evidence from Scandals About U.S. Politicians. Professor Lamis.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Ba. Thank you for having me here and for being here. So today I'm going to be talking about a paper that I've been working on. It's been maybe 2 years now. So I'm basically looking at the strategic timing in the appearance of news, precisely bad news, by relying on some evidence from scandals on US politicians. Now, the practice of strategic timing and precisely the timing of unpopular actions or bad news may be a big part of the folk wisdom in politics. And it appears in many real-world examples. And perhaps the most striking evidence was in a leaked memo from the former UK Labour Party speaker under Blair's administration right after 9/11, where she said to her superior that today is a very good day to get out anything we want to bury. And this is bad news. So this is a very brief example on how politicians might be trying to hide their unpopular actions, whether it's decisions, whether it's bad news, behind other news that are distracting the public and out there in the media. So little is known in the theory or in the literature on why scandals appear during some times and not others. But anecdotal evidence from the literature suggests that reporting some scandals is actually orchestrated under some under-table negotiations and some strategic timing being involved. And while looking for data and examining the articles or journal articles covering the politician scandals, we can see some anecdotes highlighting these negotiations and strategic timing. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And to the right side, we're looking at an article covering a scandal on Wilbur Mills, who's a U.S. representative from Arkansas, and he was involved in a sex scandal. And in fact, this report argues that media people or journalists were actually aware of the scandal way before it erupts to the media, but they kept this information and strategically timed its appearance to benefit this representative. So the scandal appeared right after the elections and not before the elections. And to the one to the left, we're looking at an article covering a scandal for James Trafficking Jr., who is also a U.S. representative from Ohio, and who accepted bribe. And also here, he was arguing that the appearance of a scandal was actually orchestrated to harm him. It appeared right before him being up for elections. So here we can already see that it's known in the media, and it's known between politicians that there is some strategic timing and orchestration of these news, but this was never empirically tested properly, or at least to the best of my knowledge. So before we go further, why do politicians care? Why do they want to hide their scandals to start with, or these bad news? So from the sample of politicians in my study, I'm showing you the impact of these scandals on politicians' elections. So you can see that before, or the election right before the scandals appeared, right before it, and even one election before, you can see that the share of votes is almost stable, but this share drops significantly once a scandal appears on a specific politician. So scandals do harm politicians' reputation, they do care about this, and they want to hide it. And this is true for all types of scandals, maybe a little bit higher for financial and sex scandals, but you can see that the decrease is applicable for all different types of scandals. So what do I do in this paper or in this project is that I assume that politicians want to distract the public from their bad behavior or their misconducts. And the underlying assumption behind this that has been discussed by Gibson in 1999 is that maybe it's better for politicians to let out their trash and their scandals before it's out there when the time is not convenient for them. and also maybe talked about, like, if the scandal was out and times where everyone is paying so much attention, maybe it's going to get more, it's going to be repeated at higher frequency, and people are going to be more aware of this misconduct or this scandal. So to answer this question, I start by building a theoretical model. I'm going to simplify it as much as possible today. So we're just going to understand the dynamics. So who are the main players behind the scandal appearance, and what are the different channels behind a scandal appearance? And then we're going to look into some empirical evidence and empirical examination of whether there is a strategic timing behind the appearance of scandals, yes or no. So, of course, when we're talking about strategic timing, we're talking about some forward-looking strategies, right? So politicians should be able to expect what's going to happen in the news for them to be able to manipulate the news or to time the appearance of their scandals. So for now, there has been some discussions previously, also under Tony Blair's administration, that politicians do share a virtual Excel sheet called the grid, in which they have different periods or different events scheduled, so they know when the news or when the media is going to be busy with other events going on. And they try to schedule their unpopular actions, if they're, for instance, increasing taxes, if they have any type of unpopular action that they want to implement, they try to time it at the same time with these events that are going on. And I was once, not long ago, presenting in Portugal, and one of the professors there who used to work at the government also told me that this is also true in Portugal. So even in Portugal, they did have an Excel sheet, basically, that they share, in which they mark important events, so they know when the media is going to be giving them attention or not. And this is for multiple reasons. It could be for bad news, but it could also be for good news. When they want to do a charity work or they want to do something that they want people to see, they also want to be doing it when people are paying attention. And the opposite is true for bad news. So empirically, I will try to predict these, or what I call the news pressure, so the volume of news. I'm going to talk more about this, and I will try to predict it to see whether we can detect some intentional strategic timing and the appearance of these bad news, of these scandals. So I will start by talking a little bit about the different mechanisms behind a scandal appearance. So, of course, we need to agree on a few points. So voters do depend on the media for the most of their political information. Okay, so they are informed from the mass media, from also, of course, political campaign, and this information will affect their voting decision. So they are relying on this information to affect their voting decision. And they update their beliefs on politicians based on the information that they are receiving. But the impact of this information changes based on how much they are exposed to this news. So if they are distracted and they are busy with other news, like the 9/11, for instance, they're not going to pay too much attention to these scandals that are appearing here and there. But they will be more exposed to these scandals when there's nothing else happening. There's nothing else happening in the news and in the world too. So I argue that that scandals have an effect on voting decision, but this effect changes based on the exposure of this scandal. So the timing here, so here's where the timing of appearance becomes very crucial, and this is why politicians might actually care about the timing of their scandal appearance. And to discuss further the different dynamics behind it, I will base my analysis on two building blocks. So we have on one side the political competition. So there is a political competition and different politicians want news to appear on different times. And we also have the media's optimal strategy when it comes to the timing of release. So let's focus, for instance, on the political competition side. So how can politicians affect the media? They can do this in different ways. They can have information and they decide to release it on a specific time. They can bribe the media to release an information on also a very specific time. They can give preferential access to friendly outlets so they would give this preferential access to news, and they would expect the media to release this news whenever they want them to. And in the US, we have basically two main political parties, and this competition is gonna decide the dynamics of the appearance of scandals. So an opponent would want the scandals on the opposite party to appear when news pressure is low, so that all voters are actually aware of this scandal, so that the share of votes for his opponent would decrease. Whereas a politician himself would want his scandal to appear when news pressure is high, so that people are busy with other news going on and they are distracted, so they wouldn't really pay attention to the scandal when it appeared. So the sign of the relationship between news pressure and the appearance of scandal would be an indicator of which political party was able to strategically time the appearance of the scandals. Now, on the other hand, we have the media. So the media, of course, can get revenues or get profits from two main sources. There is the commercial profits from advertisement, from all these ads and all journals, basically, or TVs. And there are profits from collusion with politicians. And here we're talking bribes, we're talking preferential treatment, and so on. Now, all the details here are specific for the theoretical model. I'm not going to dig too much into it, but what I'm going to say is that it has been shown in previous literature that the media would only publish news or about scandals when they don't have something else to talk about. And this is because it was shown that revenues from scandals are lower than revenues from other relevant stories. So it's only when they have nothing much to talk about that they're actually going to go and cover scandals about politicians. This is the first thing. And second, it's when they don't have a lot of news to cover, when journalists are going to go and do more investigation about these politicians and probably discover a scandal that they would want to cover. Okay, so I argue in this model that the optimal strategy for the media would be to release scandals when news pressure is actually low. Okay? So from these dynamics, we can reach an equilibrium that will guide us through the empirical findings. So if we're looking at the relationship between news pressure and the outcome that is a release of a scandal during a specific week, if we find a positive relationship, it means that politicians themselves are trying to strategically time the appearance of their own scandal. If the relationship is negative, then this would be an indicator that the opponent or the opposite political party is manipulating the media and trying to release scandals about these politicians, or that the media is the one releasing these scandals for their revenues or just for their profits. Now, this second equilibrium, it's hard really to disentangle between whether it's driven by the media or it's driven by the opponent, but it's not what we find, that's first. And second, it's been argued that political mechanisms behind the appearance of scandal are stronger than the media's basically generating revenue equation. Okay. So what do we find? So this is to understand the mechanisms. This is the theoretical model to understand what mechanisms are at play, what are the different channels at play. So what do I find when I examine this empirically? So first of all, I will talk briefly about the data collection. So I get data from different sources. So there is this site called Political Graveyard that has a lot of information about many and many politicians. And I rely basically on it to get the list of politicians that were involved in a scandal. It also provides many details about the political party of this politician, the type of scandal, how it was, so whether it was, let's say, that he was arrested, that this politician was conducted in an affair, and so on and so forth. And just to say that the sample here is not representative, so it might not include all politicians, it might not include all scandals, but what I care about here is the timing of appearance of these scandals. So even if I don't have all scandals, even if I don't have the full universe, on the sample that we have, do we find any evidence of strategic timing among politicians? Okay. And then the next step is to build a set of keywords, so keywords from the politician and from the scandal, and I do some search in both local newspapers and national newspapers, and I rely on around 2,000 newspapers and conduct the search and collect data on the first appearance and 30 days from the first appearance to see the extent or the frequency at which each scandal was covered. But the main thing that I care about here is the appearance or the first time of appearance to see whether this appearance was correlated with higher or lower news pressure. Now, how do I measure news pressure? I rely on TV news pressure from Vanderbilt Television. And the way I measure it is that I look at the time allocated or the median time allocated for the top 3 news that are covered during the night's podcast on 3 main channels that are CBC, Fox News, and ABC. So I look at the time allocated for these 3 top news, and if the time allocated for 3 top news is very high, then I say that news pressure is high because there is something important that is going on. So the podcast focused mainly on these 3 top news, and news pressure is high. And when this median time in minutes allocated to the 3 top stories is low, I argue that news pressure is low. Okay, so I'm showing you just some descriptive stats from the sample. So scandals that I focused on are between 1970 and 2018 or 2019. And we have scandals on different political parties. We're focusing here on Democrats and Republicans. So almost 65% of scandals are on Democrats. But here I want to say again that this does not mean that Democrats are more likely to commit a scandal because the sample is not representative, it's not universal. We're not arguing here that this represents all politics or all scandals, but this is what we have in the sample, and it's not going to change much about the strategic timing. And also we have different office types. We have federal legislative, state executive, and even local governments. And we have different type of scandals, sexual scandals, financial scandals, political ones, and other type of scandals. So just to put things in perspective, so sexual scandals include affairs, sodomy, sexual assault. So they are universally seen as bad behavior, as misconducts. They're not context specific. Financial scandals include embezzlement, accepting bribes, kickbacks, and political scandals include election fraud, campaign finance violations, and so on. And other scandals is basically driving under the influence or plagiarism or gambling and that type of other scandals. And then, so we call this an econometrics identification strategy, but I'm going to simplify it. So the thing is that to measure the relationship between news pressure and the appearance of scandal, there are other things that might be happening. There are other things that might be going on. Think, for instance, about the elections period. So once there is an election, news pressure is going to be high. The media is covering all these political campaigns and so on, and scandals are also more likely to appear. So if we just look at the simple relationship, it might be capturing other things that are going on. So in my identification strategy, I want to isolate these factors. I want to focus on factors that would reflect immediately the relationship between news pressure and the appearance of scandals in the media. So I divide these predictions, or what we call instruments, into 2 groups. I divide it into what we call, or what we classify as predicted events. I'm going to talk about this more in one slide. and the unpredicted events. So predicted events are the events that are going to allow politicians to be able to strategically time the appearance of their scandals because they know that these are going to happen. They know that these events are happening, as I just mentioned, from the grid, from this Excel sheet that is being shared among them, and they can actually manipulate the appearance of news based on these events. Whereas when you have unpredictable events, these are shocks, they are not predicted. The politicians are probably not going to have enough time to orchestrate the appearance of their scandal around this time, but also the media will not probably accept or agree with the politician to make this news appear when they have a lot of things going on and they want to cover many things. So what are predicted events and what are unpredicted events? So predicted events are, and yeah, just to mention that both these categories are highly correlated with news pressure. So I want events that would lead to high news pressure to start with, because this is what's going to distract the media and all the voters as well. So I rely for predicted events on conflict-related events, or in other words, military attacks. And these are almost thousands of events, and they include invasions, like the case of Panama, Afghanistan. They include military interventions, like in Bosnia, Libya, Iraq. They also include major operations, like the Persian Gulf War, for instance, and the Ocean Shield operation, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, I should mention here that US, so one would argue that are military attacks really expected? Are they really known by politicians beforehand? So there was an act that was implemented in 1973. It's called the War Powers Resolution, and it obliges the president to get the acceptance from the Congress before actually declaring any armed conflict or getting involved or getting the US involved in any armed conflict. So the Congress would be aware of such military attacks at least 2 weeks in advance, or at least 2 weeks before it happens. Now, even if this act has been breached, like for instance the case of Bill Clinton in Kosovo in 1999, the Congress still needs to approve the bills for going to war. So the Congress, even if the public is not aware, even if the Congress did not sign this agreement, they are still aware that there is a military attack that is going to be happening. Okay? The second set of predicted events are the famous trials. Of course, to stay in the context of US, I focus on famous trials happening in the US, like the case of O.J. Simpson, the case of al-Musawi, and of course, these are events that are known in advance by the public and the media, and we focus on the sentencing. So this is the event that gets the most attention from the media. So these are the predicted events. For unpredicted events, so unpredicted events are basically natural disasters or human-made disasters, whether it's a mass shooting, a bombing, and so on. So to keep it unpredicted, I limit the unpredicted events to those who took attention for only a week. Otherwise, politicians will have time to actually start orchestrate the appearance of their scandals. And I also limited to those who got at least 10 casualties out of the incident, so that it takes attention from the media. So what do I find? First of all, I find that there is a positive relationship between news pressure and the appearance of scandals. So yes, there are some evidence that politicians are trying to strategically time the appearance of their scandals or their misconducts. I also find that when I rely on unpredictable events as instrument, the effect disappears. Okay, so whenever there's unpredictable events, the correlation stops being there between the level of news pressure and the appearance of scandals. Okay, so this is a placebo check that, yes, the relationship is only there when politicians can actually predict what's happening. I also find that Republicans seem to appear their strategic timing more than Democrats, but again, this is just in the sample that I relied on, which is about like 250 politicians. And I also find that the likelihood of loss or resignation is lower for politicians whose scandal appeared when news pressure is high, which confirms the theory predictions one more time, saying that, yes, it's in their advantage to show scandals when no one's watching, because now political accountability is decreasing and voters are not really affected by the scandal anymore. So I do some additional exercises just to once again see if these results are robust. So I restrict the sample to battleground states. So battleground states are states where the margin of vote for any political party is very low. In other words, competition is so high. And this is where, if the theory predictions are correct, this is where politicians would care more about their reputation because they're risky. Their victory is shaky in these states. And indeed, when I restrict the sample to these battleground states, the effect goes up. So the strategic timing becomes even stronger. I also look at politicians who are no longer in office, so former politicians, and I see no evidence of strategic timing there, and this could be probably due to the fact that former politicians care less about, or actually they don't have any political outcomes to protect, so they still care about their reputation, of course, but they don't want to gain more voters anymore, so they're not really trying to strategically time the appearance of their scandals, nor to manipulate the media. Okay, and then, right, so if this is true, then politicians would want to let out their own scandals, but they definitely wouldn't do this right before elections, even if people are less likely to pay attention to scandals when there's a high level of news pressure. It's still going to be very harmful for them to do this right before elections. So again, when I exclude the election cycle period, which is like 4 months, so the last quarter before elections, I also find that the effect now goes up. So there is more evidence of strategic timing happening there, but not right before elections, so not during the election cycle or election period. Okay, so to conclude, I would say that scandals are not just matter of evidence. They are also related to some political context and some political agendas happening in there. Politicians might actually be making intensive efforts to manipulate the media and also the political process. And since we know that the media plays a very crucial role in informing voters about the politicians and help voters to adjust their beliefs, this problem can be very important, as not only it would decrease the media transparency, but also it would lead to lower political accountability, especially that voters are going to be less informed if politicians are trying to adopt this strategy. And another very important consequence would be that politicians are gonna, so this is gonna be limiting politicians' incentive to perform well and to try to not, or to try to abstain from any corrupted behavior or any rent-seeking activities. So it can be harmful for the whole political system and for the transparency and voter information as well. Thank you.
I don't know if you mentioned this earlier, but was there a time frame for your research?
Yeah, so scandals, I look at scandals appearing between 1970 and 2018. I think I will be extending this to 2022 now, but yeah.
Thank you, Lamis. That was a great talk. And
Thank you.
I'm not an economist, so I'm probably going to bring the intellectual caliber of the conversation down a little bit. But I wonder what you think about Prince Harry's book, because he talks a lot about how the various rival communications office of the principals in the British royal family will leak stories about each other in ways that are kind of analogous to kind of what you're describing, that if you can get your story in at a time that's less newsworthy, or if someone else is going to leak a story, well, you can leak your own not so bad story. So I don't know. This is what I thought of. So I don't know if this is a future research project for you.
Actually, this is part of this research as well, because as I mentioned in the mechanisms, like many things can be happening. So it could be the politician himself or herself wanting to let the scandal out, or it could be the opponent as well trying to leak this information. But we don't know. So from the theory, the final effect or the equilibrium is not clear. The relationship can be either positive or negative. But empirically, what I found in this sample that might not be representative, again, what I found from this sample is that politicians are trying to release their own scandals, and this seems to outweigh the leak happening. It doesn't mean that there's no leaks happening from the opponent, but it means that this is outweighing the leaks happening from the opponent.
Thank you. I remember during the Clinton presidency where the special counsel, his last name was Starr, he would time the release of information specifically prime time. Do you take that into account, the timing, so that it would make the evening news, rather than not just the day, but also the time of the day on the East Coast in DC when information was released?
This has been shown in many other papers. Actually, it's been shown that the prime news in the evening, but also that if there is an unpopular action or unpopular opinion, they would release it on weekends, on Thanksgiving's Day, on Christmas Eve, and stuff like this. So these holidays and these occasions, it's been already shown empirically and theoretically as well. So it's still strategic timing. It still goes in the same line as this, but what I'm trying to predict is something a little bit more causal, what we say. So that's why the identification strategy and so on. But evidence or anecdotes are everywhere, and it has been talked about in all type of media and all types of previous studies as well. Yeah.
I'm curious about the diminishing news landscape in the US, where you have now what I think are called news deserts, where newspapers are closing, there's less accountability, especially in the last, say, from about 2015 onwards. Have you accounted for that?
Yeah, so correct me if I'm wrong, are you referring to the partisan bias?
No, what I'm talking about is the fact that mainstream media is diminishing in popularity. It's been taken over by, we'll say, social media. Newspapers are closing. Yeah. News agencies' budgets are shrinking. Yes. Local councils are being, shall we say, less well reported on.
That's a very good question, because, okay, so first, like when we're talking social media when it comes to politics, I would think of Twitter, for instance, rather than other platforms. And Twitter appeared or started being used in 2008. And so my period of study is from the 1970s till 2018. So maybe 10 years of this would be underestimated by the rise of the social media. So it's still a work in progress. So what I'm doing now is trying to detect whether these scandals, or when the timing of these scandals' appearance on Twitter as well, just to see if this confirms what I found from the mainstream media or from journals or newspapers, basically. I'm not sure I will have much to talk about there, because it's only 10 years and the number of scandals is going to go down by a lot, but at least it's going to be some evidence to support, either to support or to contradict what I found from mainstream media.
Thank you, Professor. First of all, I think the presentation was really interesting. I just had a quick question. I wanted to know that during your research, did you happen to notice any differences between the impact of scandals that had happened in the past and resurfaced recently versus scandals that happened recently and were reported at that particular time? Was there any kind of differences in the kind of impact they had on the public?
Yes. I actually tried to split the sample between scandals that took place before 1990 and those that took place after 1990. It looks like the impact was stronger in the past. So in the past, they were trying to strategically time their scandals more and more. I'm not sure what the reason behind this yet. Like, I'm not sure how I can explain it yet. It could be due to the fact that scandals where, like, there was higher if I would say, morals, like in the past, and the scandal would be seen as a very big misconduct and a very big issue, whereas now what matters more is the political affiliation of voters. It could be due to this, but yeah, the impact was stronger in the past. Yeah.
Has definition of scandal has developed in our current times? That's it.
Yeah. Okay, so it's basically on definition of scandal. And again, this is a very interesting question because the main limitation of studies on scandals, and the reason why we don't see a lot of studies on scandals is precisely this. What is a scandal? How do we define a scandal? So most studies before relied on, let's say, one type of offices, like let's say presidents for now, and they look at the scandals that they committed. And this is the advantage of the data source that I was able to rely on, is that it classified or it enumerated all misconducts of politicians, basically, and it allowed me to rely on it without having to define what a scandal is. But as I said, like just looking at what are these types of scandals, I can assure you that these are universal. These are scandals that would be, or these are misconducts or considered as misconducts anywhere. Now, the weight that is given might differ even from a state to state. A more liberal state might find, let's say, I wouldn't say, or maybe an affair, they would be more accepting for this type of misconduct than others. There is this variation. I try to control for it empirically by adding some fixed effects, basically. But yes, I agree that it's definition of scandals that can be very challenging.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm an engineer by education.
Okay.
I spend every Friday with three good, very, very, very good friends of mine, distinguished professors in different disciplines, economics, finance, Islamic finance, and business. I always tease my PhD friends is that I call them, you are the masters of post-fact analysis. So you come to them to try to predict something, you get three different views. But when something happens, listen to them trying to analyze why this happened. So I tell them two things. One, that's why you'll never get rich because you are not really benefiting from this. The other thing is, it is all post-fact. My question to you is, this is very nice. So who benefits from this? Who benefits from this and how is it presented to them from your research?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So those who benefit are politicians, I would say.
How does a politician benefit from your research? So if I have a scandal, if I'm sitting on a scandal,
yeah.
Okay? So what do? I go back to your research and I say, you know, I think I'm going to fall in this category here.
Yeah, no, then the answer would be different.
Explain to me, please.
It's definitely not politicians. Politicians would hate my research. They will not benefit from it. But it's, I mean, not any research topic would have a direct policy implementation, okay? So, or policy recommendation. So this study per se does not have a straightforward policy recommendation, but sometimes highlighting on facts or highlighting on mistakes that are happening is by itself important, because even if it does not suggest a solution, it says that the problem is there. There is something fishy happening in there. There is something happening behind the scenes, and politicians might actually be manipulating the voting and manipulating the publics in their own benefit. So highlighting on this fact by itself can be seen as a contribution, and it's the first step to start and think about what are the solutions, or how can we find a way to stop or prevent this from happening.
I'm curious what you say about the bribing of journalists, and I'm sort of reminded of the quote by Humbert Wolf. How much evidence is there of journalists being bribed to, shall we say, bury a story?
That, unfortunately, I cannot measure. Like, I don't know how even the politicians were able to influence these media outlets, and I don't think anyone so far was able to, unless there's another scandal on a bribe that took place. So I don't really know. Like, I don't really know whether these influences happen even through bribes or through just giving friendly access or preferential access for these media outlets. This is outside the scope of my study, but also very, very hard to measure in numbers or empirically.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. I'm just wondering, in the data as well, did you include as examples where, for example, not the opposition party, but maybe the media sort of try to force somebody to admit to a scandal?
Yeah. So I did look at whether there is any partisan bias in the media. So it's known, or the media in the US at least was accused for a long time of this type of bias, like to prefer a political party over the other, and they would try to publish news on one political party specifically. So to examine whether this was the case, at least in my sample, I looked at the coverage of every politician, so just his or her name, not the scandal, just the name of politician for 30 days before and 30 days after the scandal appearance. And what the data has suggested is that you can see a significant increase after the scandal's appearance for both political parties, so for Republicans and for Democrats. But when you look at the difference among different political parties, either before or after the scandal, there is no evidence that the media is trying to push for a political party. So at least in my sample, there is no evidence of partisan bias among different newspapers. That's first. And second, the sample, or where I looked for scandals, there is about 2,000 newspapers. So this also might decrease the impact of having any type of preference for these news outlets for politicians. Thank you. Yeah. So let me just clarify one thing. I'm not defining scandals whatsoever. I'm just looking at when, so the misconduct has happened. And this, no event can intervene with the event happening or the misconduct taking place. What I'm looking at is when this misconduct has been transformed from being just a misconduct that the politician has committed at one point in his life to being a scandal and it appears in the media. Okay, so I'm looking at the appearance of scandals in the media, but the misconduct, no event can play a role in what's happening in the politician's private life or personal life or even political agenda and so on. So this is the first part of the question. The second part of the question, so what I'm trying to do is the following. So there is a relationship between newspapers and the appearance of scandals in the media. I want to predict this news pressure by other things that are happening. And I divided these other things into two groups, so predicted and unpredicted events. So both predicted and unpredicted events are events that would lead to a high news pressure, so they would capture the media's attention and also distract the public from paying attention to a specific news about a politician. Both these categories have this effect. Now, the difference between them is that predicted news can be used for strategic timing in the future because it's known by politicians, whereas unpredicted news cannot. Like, it's not the case for unpredicted news. So when you examine this relationship empirically, if the predictions are correct, if the theory exists, if there is any strategic timing, you would see the relationship between news pressure and the appearance of scandal only present when you predict news pressure by predictable news. When you predict news pressure by the unpredicted news or the shocks, you would not expect to see this relationship. And the reason why I limited unpredicted news to a specific number of casualties is because I wanted to be able to predict the level of news pressure. So if you have an accident that involved only one person, the media is not going to talk much about it. So probably it's not going to affect the news pressure. And that's why I focused on more or less big catastrophes or big events that were happening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. My question is quite similar to the difference question that was raised earlier. So
Do you think like technology has played, like, advancements in technology has played a role in terms of like strategic timing, and as well as the reception of the scandals themselves, but like especially between considering the 1990s as well as like the current era, like 21st century? Yeah.
I don't think that technology, except if you're referring to social media, then this, yes. But I cannot think at least of any technological event that would have an impact on the appearance of a scandal. Now, empirically, I did still account for this, so I did, how do I say it in a non-technical way? So I did hold every decade fixed when I was looking at the strategic timing. So we call this decade fixed effects, but I in my empirical strategy, I did control for the specific trends that might be happening in every decade. So I took this into account, even though I don't think it's really related to technological shocks. I think more it's related to how a scandal is perceived by voters in every decade. That's what I was afraid of and when I was examining this, but not really technology, except for the social media subject. Yeah.
Any last questions? If not, I have two. One is for Professor Kola. Will you share your copy of Despair with me? Because I've been trying to get my hands on it for ages. I haven't. And the second is for Lamis. Since you have increased your timeline, I hope you can come back and share your further research findings with us, and we will love to have you.
I have other topics
All
I
right.
can talk about too, if you're interested.
Absolutely. So please join me in thanking Professor Lamis for a wonderful talk.